When you walk through the halls of the Louvre Museum in Paris today, you're surrounded by the greatest collection of beauty in the world. You see the Mona Lisa, the Winged Victory, and the Venus de Milo. You see a monument to human culture and civilization. But if you could travel back in time to the year 1810, you would not be standing in a museum. You would be standing in a crime scene. The Louvre was not built on the patronage of the arts. It was built on the largest armed robbery in the history of mankind. Every statue and every painting was a receipt for a conquered city. This is Tom from the Collapse Log, exploring the rise and fall of empires. Because behind every golden age lies a quiet decay no one sees until it is too late. The French Empire under Napoleon Bonaparte is often remembered for its military genius. We study the maps of Austerlitz and the cavalry charges of Jena. We look at the uniforms and the eagles, and we see glory, but we rarely ask the most important question of all: how did they pay for it? War is expensive. Cannons cost money. Horses cost money. Feeding 500,000 men marching across Europe costs an astronomical amount of money. And yet, for 15 years, France seemed to have infinite money. While Britain was drowning in debt and printing paper money to survive, France had a stable gold currency. The franc germinal was the envy of Europe. There were no taxes on the French middle class. The streets of Paris were being paved, and new bridges were rising over the Seine. To the outside observer, it looked like an economic miracle. It looked like Napoleon had cracked the code of prosperity, but it was a lie. The French economy was a zombie. It was a Frankenstein monster stitched together from the corpses of other nations. It did not produce wealth, it extracted it. Napoleon had created a Ponzi scheme of conquest, where the only way to pay for the last war was to start a new one. To understand this, we have to look at the philosophy of the man himself. Napoleon was not an economist, he was a soldier. He believed in the ancient Roman maxim that war must feed war. He believed that the defeated army should pay the expenses of the victors. But he took this concept and industrialized it. He turned the French army into the most efficient debt collection agency the world had ever seen. When Napoleon took power in 1799, the French state was bankrupt. The treasury was empty. The paper money of the revolution was worthless. He needed cash immediately to secure his power, and he found that cash in Italy. The Italian campaign is often taught as a military masterclass, but it was really a heist. When Napoleon marched into the rich cities of northern Italy, he didn't just defeat their armies, he assessed them. He sent his agents into the banks and the palaces and the churches. He demanded millions of francs in gold and silver as the price of peace. But he didn't stop at money. He realized that money runs out, but art is eternal. He included secret clauses in his peace treaties. These clauses demanded the surrender of specific works of art. The Duke of Parma was forced to hand over 20 paintings by Raphael and Michelangelo. The Pope was forced to hand over 100 statues and paintings, plus 500 ancient manuscripts. Imagine the humiliation. The French soldiers would walk into the Vatican pack, up the Laocoon group, and the Apollo Belvedere into crates and cart them away like furniture. These were not just objects. They were the soul of Italy. They were the symbols of its heritage, and Napoleon took them to decorate his capital. But the greatest victim was Venice. The Republic of Venice had stood for 1,000 years. It was the richest city in the world. When Napoleon conquered it, he didn't just occupy it. He stripped it to the bone. He took the gold from the treasury. He took the silver from the churches. He took the ships from the arsenal. And most famously, he climbed up to the Basilica of San Marco and took the 4 ancient bronze horses that had watched over the square for centuries. He sent them to Paris to be placed on top of a triumphal arch. It was a message to the world. Paris is the new Rome, and everything you own belongs to us. This looting served 2 purposes. First, it filled the French treasury. The gold from Italy essentially capitalized the Bank of France. It stabilized the currency and allowed Napoleon to pay his soldiers in hard coin. This made the army fiercely loyal to him. They knew that as long as they followed Napoleon, they would be rich. Second, it created a sense of imperial grandeur. The people of Paris forgot that they lived in a police state because they were living in the center of the world. They could walk into the museum and see the treasures of the entire continent gathered in one place. It was a drug, and the French people became addicted to the high of conquest. But like any addiction, it required higher and higher doses to get the same effect. By 1805, the money from Italy was gone, spent on uniforms and palaces. So Napoleon turned his eyes to Austria and Germany. The campaign of 1805 against Austria and Russia was a financial necessity. When Napoleon crushed the Austrians at Austerlitz, he imposed a treaty that demanded 40 million francs in gold. This was a massive sum. It drained the Austrian economy for years. But the real jackpot was Prussia in 1806. Prussia was a rich kingdom. When Napoleon defeated the Prussian army at Jena, he unleashed a system of organized pillage that was breathtaking in its scale. He didn't just ask for a lump sum. He imposed a war indemnity of hundreds of millions of francs. He seized all the tax revenue of the Prussian state. For years, every tax dollar paid by a Prussian citizen went directly to Paris. He set up a special institution called the Domaine Extraordinaire. This was a secret bank account that only Napoleon controlled. It was separate from the French national budget. It was funded entirely by loot. He used this slush fund to pay his generals and to give gifts to his marshals. He created a new aristocracy of dukes and princes, and he gave them massive estates in Poland and Germany and Italy. But these estates didn't produce revenue for the locals. They produced revenue for the French officers who owned them. The entire continent of Europe was turned into a feeder system for the French elite. And behind the soldiers came the shadow army, the army of bureaucrats and art connoisseurs. The most famous of these was a man named Dominique Vivant Denon. Denon was the director of the Louvre, which was then called the Musée Napoleon. He was a cultured man, a man of taste, and he was the greatest thief in history. He traveled with the Grand Army like a vulture. While the smoke was still clearing from the battlefield, Denon would be riding into the conquered cities with a shopping list. He knew exactly which paintings were in which churches. He knew which statues were in which palaces. He would walk into a gallery in Berlin or Vienna, point to a masterpiece, and say, "The emperor requires this for the education of the French people." And the soldiers would take it down. In Spain, they took so much silver from the churches that they had to melt it down into ingots just to transport it. In Vienna, they took the crown jewels. In Berlin, they took the sword of Frederick the Great. Napoleon famously visited the tomb of Frederick the Great in Potsdam, took the dead king's sword and sash, and sent them to Paris. He said, "I am better than him, so I deserve his sword." This was not just greed, it was policy. It was the Frankenstein economy. By 1810, France appeared to be the wealthiest nation on earth. The Domaine Extraordinaire held hundreds of millions of francs in gold. The taxes were low. The economy was booming. But it was a boom based on destruction. You see, there is a fundamental flaw in an economy based on looting. You eventually run out of things to steal. And more importantly, you destroy your customers. By stripping Germany and Italy and Austria of their wealth, Napoleon ensured that they could not buy French goods. He wanted French industry to dominate Europe, but nobody in Europe had any money left to buy French products because Napoleon had taken it all. The industries of Lyon and Paris began to suffer. The warehouses were full of silk and porcelain, but the orders stopped coming. And then came the bills. The problem with a military empire is that the army is a fixed cost that never goes down. You have to feed the men, you have to buy the gunpowder, you have to replace the horses. As long as the army is moving and winning, the war pays for itself. The soldiers eat the food of the enemy. The enemy pays the wages. But what happens when the army stops? What happens when there is peace? Suddenly, the cost of 500,000 men falls on the French taxpayer. Napoleon knew this. He knew that peace was actually more expensive than war. He couldn't afford to bring the army home. He had to keep them abroad, living off the land of others. This forced him into a cycle of perpetual conflict. He had to find new enemies to loot, to pay for the army that he needed to keep the loot he had already taken. It was a shark that had to keep swimming or die. And in 1808, he made his fatal mistake. He invaded Spain. He thought Spain would be another quick cash grab. He thought he would loot the churches, take the Spanish silver, and install his brother on the throne. But Spain was different. The Spanish people rose up in a guerrilla war. They didn't fight big battles that Napoleon could win. They ambushed supply convoys. They killed sentries. Spain became a bleeding ulcer. Instead of sending gold back to Paris, Spain began to consume gold. Napoleon had to pour millions of francs into Spain just to keep his army alive. The flow of wealth reversed. For the first time, the looting wasn't covering the cost. And then came Russia. The invasion of Russia in 1812 was the ultimate attempt to refill the bank account. Napoleon looked at the vast wealth of the Russian Empire and saw the solution to his economic problems. He marched 600,000 men into Russia, the largest army ever assembled. It was an investment. He expected a quick victory, a massive indemnity, and a fresh injection of gold into the Domaine Extraordinaire. But the Russians didn't play by the rules. They retreated. And as they retreated, they burned. They burned the crops. They burned the villages. They burned the bridges. And finally, they burned Moscow itself. When Napoleon marched into Moscow expecting to find a city of gold, he found a city of ash. There was nothing to loot. There was no food. There were no paintings. There was no gold. The Frankenstein monster starved. The retreat from Russia destroyed the Grand Army. But it also destroyed the French economy. Napoleon had lost hundreds of thousands of horses and millions of francs worth of equipment. And he had nothing to show for it. When he returned to Paris in 1813, the illusion began to crack. The Domaine Extraordinaire was empty. The loot was gone. He had to do the one thing he promised he would never do. He had to raise taxes on the French people. And suddenly the magic was gone. The people realized that the glory was expensive. They realized that their sons were dying not to protect France, but to steal paintings for a museum they would never visit. The banks began to fail. The credit of the state collapsed. The wealthy merchants who had supported Napoleon turned against him. They realized that his endless wars were bad for business. When the allied armies of Russia, Prussia, and Austria marched into Paris in 1814, they weren't just coming to remove Napoleon. They were coming to get their stuff back. The scene at the Louvre in 1815 was one of the most pathetic moments in French history. The British commander, the Duke of Wellington, stationed troops at the doors of the museum. And then the teams of movers arrived. The Austrians came for their paintings. The Prussians came for their statues. The Pope sent a delegation to take back the Laocoon. The curator Denon tried to stop them. He argued that these works belonged to France now by the right of conquest. He screamed that he was preserving them for civilization, but the Prussians didn't care. They marched into the galleries and took down the paintings. The bronze horses of San Marco were lowered from the triumphal arch in front of a weeping crowd of Parisians. It was the unraveling of the Ponzi scheme. The assets were being seized by the creditors. France was left with nothing but debt and a smaller border than when Napoleon started. The gold was gone, the glory was gone, and the art was gone. The only thing that remained was the myth. Napoleon spent his final years on St. Helena writing his memoirs. He painted himself as a liberator. He claimed he wanted to create a United States of Europe. He claimed he fought for liberty. But the ledgers tell a different story. The financial records of the empire reveal a criminal enterprise masquerading as a government. They reveal a system that could only survive by devouring its neighbors. The tragedy of Napoleon is not that he lost. It is that he built a structure that was destined to collapse from the very beginning. You cannot build a golden age on stolen gold. You cannot build a lasting economy on the misery of others. The Louvre today is still one of the greatest museums in the world. But when you look at the collections that remain, you have to wonder about the ghost of the collections that left. And you have to wonder about the modern empires of the world. We live in an age where we think we have moved past this kind of plunder. We don't march armies into cities to steal statues anymore. But the logic of the Frankenstein economy is still with us. We see nations that sustain their high standard of living, not by production, but by financial engineering. We see economies that rely on the debt of others. We see systems that require constant expansion and constant consumption to keep from collapsing. We see the extraction of resources from the periphery to the center. It is cleaner now. It is done with spreadsheets and trade deals rather than bayonets and wagons. But the dynamic is the same. The quiet decay of the French Empire happened because it forgot the most basic rule of economics. Wealth must be created, not just moved around. Napoleon was the ultimate mover. He moved borders. He moved armies. He moved gold. And he moved art. But in the end, he created nothing that lasted. The roads he built were used by the armies that invaded him. The bridges he built were crossed by the men who defeated him. And the museum he filled was emptied by the people he robbed. It serves as a stark warning to any nation that believes it can live beyond its means by force. The bill always comes due, the creditors always return, and the horses of San Marco always go home. The next time you see a picture of Napoleon with his hand in his coat, remember that he is not just striking a pose. He is guarding a wallet that isn't his. He was a man who conquered the world, but couldn't balance a checkbook without a gun. And that is why his empire fell. Not because of the snow in Russia, but because of the emptiness in the vault. This is Tom from the Collapse Log. We look at the statues, but we should be looking at the receipts. Because the art of the deal is often just the art of the steal. And history is the ultimate judge and jury.